So, welcome to Sayers. Has written his way through his professional life as a published poet, playwright, advertising copywriter, and is a certified journal to the self facilitator. And he's also working as a transformational coach specializing in creativity and writing. Very welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning to you. So, we're having this conversation because you are joining us at the Barcelona Journaling Festival as a speaker. And obviously, we've had quite a few conversations before, and I'm really excited to having you there. I'm also super happy about your topic. So maybe just jump off from that point and just hear a little bit about what you're planning to do in your
Yeah.
workshop and the background for
Okay.
it.
So just for the audience, when you say speak, I'm not going to be giving a lecture. I'm going to be facilitating a workshop, and it's more about the people attending than it is about me spouting. But so the title of my workshop is "Dreaming the City Within," and that came to me kind of quite intuitively, really, because I love Barcelona. I think I've only been once, but it stayed in my memory. I was there a good few days and I saw a lot. And just the sheer wonderful expressiveness of the city made me feel that I wanted to do something about the city, but also about the city as a symbol for the self, the inner self, the soul. I do a lot of work with Jungian psychology in mind. So a lot of my journaling exercises and workshops are based around Jungian ideas. And he often found, including in himself as a subject, that dreams would come up with cities, which actually were a metaphor for the whole of the self. He used a capital S for self. So it's not really about the self as in selfishness, but as in the whole inner self. In a way, it's another word for the soul. So it's the whole of our inner life. And he had a famous dream about Liverpool, of all places, which is
Wow.
called his Liverpool dream. And he'd never actually been there. But when he analysed it, he realised it was about the word pool, and life from liver, and that this dream was about the pool of life. He'd been drawing mandalas, which are essentially circles, often in squares, with a cross down the middle of the circle. And so it's divided into sort of quarters and with a central circle as well. But in the dream, in the center of this city of Liverpool, which I think was also sort of circular in the dream, but in the center circle was a tree with bright lights. And so this was, for him, the end of his many years of drawing mandalas, because that dream had sort of basically been the crowning glory of that phase of exploration. So anyway, not to get too technical, the idea is that here we are in this really extraordinary and unique city. And another point that Jung constantly makes is that we are each of us unique, and we need to individuate, and not to, if we try to conform for conformity's sake, then we run into trouble, because we're kind of born with an inner code. This is the theory of individuation. And through our lives, if we keep our eyes and ears open, we're reflective enough, and we listen to an inner voice, for which all journaling is very helpful for all that, then we will follow our own star. So that's why partly the uniqueness and expressiveness of Barcelona really appeals to me. It's kind of, it's all there and it's so live. So this will be a way of looking at each of us, our own inner city. In fact, one of the great psychologists, Jungian psychologists who followed on from Jung, Darrell Sharp, created a bookshop and a publishing outfit which he called Inner City, and that was actually based Inner City Books. They're still going, publishing almost entirely Jungian and post-Jungian titles, but that was entirely based on that idea of the self as a city within. And one other thing to say about that is that people will often talk about our inner world, but the idea was that even for our dream self to dream about a whole world within was just a bit too much. But somehow a city concretizes things, and it's easy to come up with metaphors for aspects of the self when you think about all the things that a city contains.
Yeah, go tell me a little bit more about that, because I remember we had a discussion around that before, and you mentioned like different parts of the city representing different aspects
Yeah,
of the
so I
self.
think what we'll probably do is each of us. I haven't fully got there with the format of the workshop, but my current thinking is about doing a guided meditation, and each of us taking a walk through our imaginary city of the self, and walking from one quarter to another. Um, and what do we see there? What are the main monuments? What do we see? Park.
Mhm.
What's in nature? If there's a gallery with one really valuable work of art, that has to be guarded day and night, what is that for you? And so on. So that, we'll take a sort of stroll, closing our eyes and using these sort of internal guided meditations, and write in between times. And then we'll go back over and see what this exploration of our inner city has told us about ourselves. And of course, every city has its kind of uh, smarter areas, and it's less salubrious areas. It's dark places that maybe we're frightened to go to. Um, and it has its high places, its places of worship, and it has its low places. And there's a whole thing going on underground with cables and wires and sewers and all sorts of things that are hidden. So I think it should be creative and fun, but also hopefully bringing rich insights to the people who come along.
I mean, I love the idea. I remember the first time you told me about it, I thought it sounded absolutely brilliant. But then again, I'm also very much into that kind of layered level of psyche,
Yeah,
right? The fact that you are where you're talking about it on, higher and it goes further down, and that and those areas that you said that sometimes we're unwilling to
yeah,
go to, that we're scared of going to. So I
yeah,
think this is one of the powers of journaling, that it gives a way to go in there in a safe way somehow. So
yeah,
it's
and to explore those different levels because they are there, but maybe we are not exploring
yeah.
all of them. And another thing is Jung called the persona, which is the sort of mask that we wear between ourselves, our own ego identity, and the outside world, and that everyone can put on that mask, and it's actually very helpful in society. If a doctor behaves like a doctor, for example, so we'll have a certain manner, maybe even a white coat. Sometimes there's a uniform that goes with it, but
Mhm.
sometimes it can get in the way when we are over-identified with our persona. So we never stop being the school teacher when we're talking to our spouse or our children or our parents, even, or anyone, for example, that we.
Yeah, anyone outside of the
Yes,
classroom.
exactly. So how the city presents itself or tries to present itself to other cities is, and visitors is something we'll be looking at as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say that Barcelona is actually quite interesting like that if you look at the history of the
Mm.
architecture, because huge parts of the Gothic quarter were not actually Gothic. They were made Gothic later on as a way to kind of promote that aspect of it, which is also somehow a beautiful idea of the city. I like this sense that they were like, okay, just screw it. Let's just make it more
Yeah,
nice. It's more beautiful like that. And there was some kind of a shameless kind of tapping into one element of the history and going, let's just put more of this around different
yeah, you,
places,
you
and
can do that.
somehow reversing the
Yeah,
yeah, the
to fit
facades.
the sort of zeitgeist of what people are
Yep.
interested in at the time. So you can dial something up or down, but regardless of whether you do that, it's all of it is still there. So
Yes.
yeah.
So this is an amazing topic, but then I'm curious, like how on earth did you get into this side of journaling? I mean, you talked to me before about like journaling and poetry therapy and all these
Mhm.
kind of things. I'm just curious, like, what's your kind of short version of your
Short
origin
version.
story into
I was going to
journaling?
say, how long have you got? But let me see if I can sort of give you the headlines. I mean, I was always writing from when I was a little boy. I would spend my pocket money on a pocket jotter. It was a sort of spiral bound notebook, square, tiny. And I never knew what to write in it. I knew I wanted to write stories. I would ask my mother and grandmother to give me something to write about. And they would always say something really that didn't capture my imagination at all. Write about a story about a daisy or something, like that. And I was just like, oh, well, what? There's no conflict there or whatever. But so
Oh, there can be.
writing was to me like a really natural and very strong interest from a very early age. And um, the word generally, but spoken and written. I later trained as an actor, and it took me a while to sort of make sense of how that came about. But it was part of the journey of expression and part of exploring, I think, all the characters within me. And we all carry a lot of archetypes, and we can identify more with some than with others. So acting was an opportunity to do that. Um, and then I went into advertising as a copywriter. So this was at a time when I still was requiring a brief, albeit now not from my mother and grandmother telling me what to write about, but from paying clients. And there was still part of me all that time that was very interested in poetry, in reading it, and I'd written a little bit here and there. So all the time I was in advertising, I was attending poetry classes, and I actually had a sort of photograph on my desk, which marked me out from many of my colleagues who would have, beer ads on their desks. But it was a photograph of from the inside of the offices of Faber and Faber with T.S. Eliot and Louis MacNeice and C. Day Lewis and W.H. Auden standing holding a glass of sherry. And there's Ted Hughes, who was then the coming man, with his little glass of sherry. He just published his first collection with Faber. So they were my sort of role models, I suppose. And I thought, well, when I get out of advertising, I knew it wasn't something I wanted to stay in forever. Then I'm going to go and study poetry. So I did that for several years, actually. Really immersed myself in writing poetry and in the London poetry scene. Ran a poetry magazine called Magma with some very talented colleagues. Became a trustee of the Poetry Society, attended a lot of classes, wrote a lot of poems, was publishing them. But there came a point where I was feeling like that my motivation in writing was generally about discovering the world and the world within, or how the outer world and the inner world connected. And I felt that there was just a lot of ego going on in the poetry world, and there was not a lot of wisdom. People may have been writing poems that were very full of insights that would be useful to other people, but somehow the poets around me didn't seem to be applying the insights they themselves that were coming through them onto the page. So I sort of looked up I just put into Google, poetry therapy. I thought there must be something like that. I'd never heard of it. And up came the National Association for Poetry Therapy in the States, which was doing a conference. It does a conference every year. So I sort of hopped on a plane and went to Kansas and explored that. And at the same time, I then started studying therapeutic writing online. The very good.
How did that come about, though? Then what was the trigger to go into the therapeutic writing?
Well, it was just that feeling like there has to be, because so Sharon Olds, American poet, she won the T.S. Eliot Prize in London for a collection of poems that she wrote in 2012, and she was interviewed everywhere. I think she won the prize, and she was asked, what do you want most from a poem when you write it? Most for a poem when you write it? And she said, I want a poem to be useful. And I think that was it for me. I didn't want a poem just to be admired or thought to be clever, or a poem that would win a prize. And a lot of the poems, being honest, I couldn't understand. They were sort of too obscure. I couldn't really make use of them. And I wasn't sure that a lot of study of some of these poems would actually yield much.
There's a whole world of academia just built around this whole
Yeah,
concept.
and it was disappearing up itself.
Yes.
A lot of poems were doing that. So I was interested in poems that had something to say to people, would connect with people's own inner worlds and preoccupations and concerns and questions. And then, that I found out that in poetry therapy, then you use a lot of journaling exercises to write in response to poems so that you can amplify that connection you started to feel between what you're reading on the page and
Hmm.
what you're feeling inside.
So the poem works as kind of an advanced and subconscious level of
Yeah,
prompt in a way,
exactly. And because of its
right? Mhm.
language, which is partly conscious and partly unconscious, and because it talks a
Mhm.
lot in images and symbols, really, symbols are the voice of the unconscious. So it speaks to us on a deeper level, generally, than prose. Although, my definition of what is poetic is that there's a large unconscious content in it. So a lot of journaling for me is a form of poetic investigation.
Yeah. Mhm. Or at least it can be. Yeah.
Yeah. um, and so I then found that I did a couple of courses with the Therapeutic, what's it called? The Professional Writing Academy, which is an online, very good uh, sort of school. And there were two courses run by Vicky Field and Anne Taylor. And one was Introduction to Therapeutic and Reflective Writing. This is still going. And another one was called Running Writing Groups. And one was an 8-week course, one was a 6-week course. And I found that I really loved that way of learning. It just worked for me. Working in my own space at home, it was still time bound, but you didn't have to be present at any particular time. But there were assignments every week. And so when we got to the end of that, I thought, oh, I want to carry on with this. So I then I'd come across the Therapeutic Writing Institute, whose esteemed head we have as part of the Barcelona Journaling Festival as well, Kathleen, people who know her as Kay. And so I signed up for a course called Recon Mission, which was by Anjana Deshpande, who's a wonderful facilitator and psychologist uh, based in America. And she had written a course which was aimed at working with Vietnam veterans. So it was called Recon Mission because a lot of these guys were suffering from PTSD and other stress-related kind of mental issues. And it was a really playful course. It was using a lot of kind of military memes and tropes. So it was speaking in their language. And she
Mhm.
published the results of that. You can actually look it up and find her sort of report on it online, and Jon Deshpande Recon Mission. And I thought, this is great. I'll just do this course and then I'll be fully equipped to just go out and teach this stuff. And then I thought, maybe there's a bit more for me to learn when I got to the end of that.
Famous last words. I've done my courses
Yeah.
now.
And then I got a bit addicted, but in a good way. And I did a course called Psychological Differences, which taught me a lot about the different kinds of psychological issues people can have, and taught me a lot about my ignorance and also about my prejudices around some of those. And so then I thought, I'm going to do the full training here. So I carried on with that. But then ultimately, all these words like therapeutic writing and therapeutic journaling, all very good. And Jung also talks about psychotherapy, and it means healing the soul. Psyche is the soul, and therapy means to heal, I think. Um,
Mhm.
and that's all very good, but there was a bit of a sort of medicalization around it all. Like someone's got a problem. It might be a physical disease. So people will work with groups with cancer. People will work uh, with people with anxiety and depression or PTSD and so on. Um, with people with eating disorders and so on. But what I liked about Jung's model is that it doesn't pathologize anything. And
Right.
and actually, the goal of Jungian work is to expand your own consciousness, to actually explore your shadow, which I know is your subject, our special subject, Oliver,
Yeah.
and
Mm.
and to allow more light, into the self. And this is called individuation. This whole process, and not many people go on that journey because it can be very
No.
frightening, to look inside oneself, destabilizing, um, which is why we always are quite careful with trigger warnings and, saying how we're going to manage it. Actually, James Pennebaker, the great American psychologist who pioneered sort of writing for trauma, talks about the flip out rule. So while you're writing, if you find yourself flipping out, stop. and write about something else, or add subject up later, which is a very practical rule. So we needn't make sort of too much of it. But so that's what really interested me was, and Jung spent his entire life and career really mapping the human soul um, in such interesting and extraordinarily detailed sort of ways, and exploring the myths of many different peoples around the world and throughout history, and also the very he's got a reputation for being a bit of a mystic and maybe a bit woo-woo, although that's fading now, that reputation, because he was exploring things like, the tarot and the I Ching and even UFOs, alchemy, which is a subject I'm really looking at closely now in relation to poetry and journaling. Um, and Yet he was seeing these as expressions, outward expressions of the human soul, of the human psyche. Even the big organized religions, Christianity and so on, are expressions of something deep inside us that's hidden within us. And yet they
Mhm.
somehow caught on in such a huge way with so many people over so many years that there has to be something in them. And then he was he would have these hunches, and then he'd be quite empirical about them. And really, I mean, apparently he listened to and analyzed 67,000 dreams before he started drawing any conclusions about dreams, and dream symbolism. So he was a very, very good scientist as well. Anyway, I'll bore everyone more with your
The problem is you won't bore me with
okay.
this. Is
If they come to the work,
let's bring it back into
yeah,
a more of a practical sense,
yeah,
and I guess one of the things I'm kind of curious about at the moment is just looking at the world and seeing how polarized it's becoming. And um, it's interesting. I'm just kind of trying to draw these. I'm just seeing these patterns at the moment myself, and seeing this polarization on one end. But also, I was reading a book you recommended to me by Robert A.
hmm
Johnson, and he's talking there about obviously the shadow and the light, but he's talking about it in the context of a mandala,
oh yes,
right? Which is like diagram with the two circles, but the
yes, rather
overlapping.
than the
Uh,
mandala, yeah, the mandala, which is the
yes,
Italian for almond, is the almond shape in the middle.
yeah,
And so,
and you got this basically like a Venn
yes,
diagram, right? Where you
yes,
got the two circles. But just seeing this interesting aspect of polarization, and with the mandala, and how he talks about the kind of I don't know if the joy in many ways is in that middle
mm,
part, because you're not on the extremes. And he also uses the metaphor of a seesaw, and if you're too far on one side or too far on the other
yeah,
side, you're out of balance. And the reality is to kind of try to find a way into the middle.
yes,
So what I'm getting at more is the sense, like, how do you see journaling and the benefits we can get from that as a tool in today's age? I mean, seeing how we are polarized and how we're so easy to jump to conclusions around somebody else's
yeah,
identity and their
yeah,
being through knowing very
yeah.
little.
Um, well, this is all about really partly seeing the other person's point of view. Um,
Mhm.
i- in terms of the world, I mean, we can't single-handedly change the world, but Jung does say that, your magnum opus, your great work can be just, being the fragment that you're supposed to be in the whole picture, and not trying to be your ambition, not having to be bigger than that, because that will actually
Mhm.
then it can't be bigger than that. Therefore you will end up doing nothing. So better to say, okay, I'm just going to be this fragment and do what I can. And I've also heard this described as if we can each pluck our own individual shadow out of the collective shadow, then we're doing a huge service, by actually creating more consciousness. So, I mean, in journaling, one exercise that can be very useful is the dialogue, which in its very form is allowing for, discussion between two parties, that one may be on one side and one may be more on the other, or come up with counter arguments or surprising ideas, or challenge us in some way. But the other way is, so I run a workshop on Jung's theory of the poetry and Jung's tension, the theory of the opposites, in which we do a lot of writing. And there's a poem I use by Edwin Morgan, who was the sort of poet laureate of Scotland, died in his 90s, I think, a few years ago. And he wrote a wonderful poem called A View of Things. And it alternates love and hate. What I love about X is Y. What I hate about B is C, and so it goes on. And so putting your hate and your love side by side, especially when aimed at the same object. So what I love about Oliver is this. What I hate about Oliver is that. And
Yeah.
keeping on going through that process is a really great way to say, okay, I can hold this tension. If I can hold this tension of the opposite, and we'll have that. We'll have ambivalent feelings about everything and everyone, and that's normal and has to be there, because the tension between the opposites, as Jung says, is the source of all energy and of all life. And in fact, the greater the tension, the greater the energy. And yet somehow this is a form of analysis, because it's actually just breaking up into parts, into sort of fragments, this whole monolith of hatred or of love, where I completely love and adore this, person, and I completely loathe that person. But
So the balance is gone,
yeah,
basically.
yeah,
It's just taking singular
yeah.
projections.
And you're bringing light into the darkness and darkness into the light. That's the really both. Neither of them is a real situation. Neither,
Yeah.
if we idealize somebody, or we ourselves present ourselves as all sweetness and light, then we are denying the shadow. And if we say something is all
Yeah.
bad, then we're out of balance there too.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm just shuffling about here and my angle's changing.
No, that's interesting. I mean, I'm a big proponent of dialogue writing. It's something I use a lot with the writing group as well. I think it's incredibly powerful. But I think another one that really goes to the heart of this for me is points of view writing as well,
Yes.
perspectives, and taking that opportunity to basically imagine yourself in somebody else's
Yeah.
shoes. But what I'm curious about with this, because I know with myself, I just through my own personal experience as a child, I ended up with a huge dose of empathy through, my own experience. But I'm curious because you said you studied acting, and acting is essentially empathy in practice,
Yeah.
in the sense that going into a role, you have to empathize with that character in order to take it on board. And my theory is that the greater empathy, the easier it is to journal, in the sense that it's easier to create an emotional connection with yourself in order to write. And I might be, putting my ladder up the wrong tree with this, but I'm curious how you
I
see
think we can
this.
overemphasize empathy and our own empathy, as empathy is a good thing, but it can somehow then hide our rage from us, or our disappointment and our sadness. Okay. So we think, okay, well, because of that bad experience, I'm a more empathetic person. But we may not have actually explored the rage and anger and letdown that we felt, and that's really important to do as well. So uh, I can't remember where I was going to go with that. You have to help that.
That's a very interesting idea, though.
Yeah,
I'll have to explore that
yeah.
more.
So I know. Yeah, I know what I was going to say. So even with acting, I mean, you get a lot of actors who are very, very one-sided politically, and so when I decided to sort of stop acting, I was in a production of King Lear, which is possibly the darkest play that I know, and apparently lots of people who play Lear have to have therapy afterwards, because they're it's so powerful that the language gets into you, and the situations sort of get into you. But I remember that the women playing Goneril and Regan, who people who aren't familiar with King Lear, are the king's essentially evil daughters. Greedy, uncaring, power crazed. And the women playing those parts were, I couldn't believe it, over coffee, just saying, well, obviously they're that way because Lear was a terrible father, and they're just strong women, and so they were not seeing that there was any dark side to these characters, and that actually put me into a sort of state of feeling very uncomfortable, because that was going on a lot around the place. And I think, yes, you do, to an extent, you identify with the character you're playing, but you have to remember that you're playing a character in a whole story. You're not just, it's not just about that character's story. And if the character is supposed to be evil or power hungry, I mean, Jung says, you know, where there is a will to power, there is no love. So sometimes you have to have those power crazed characters where you don't really see. Sometimes they're quite sort of flat or extreme characters, so in Bond films, where you don't really see there's any capacity for love at all. That's not explored. So yeah. Um, so yes, I think empathy needs to be there, but we also need to be aware of all the other things that are going on at the same time. I
Hmm.
don't think you can reach a point where you are just purely empathic. And this is why I also say that, you know, gratitude journaling, that we ought to really also write some grouses down, you know, so when, rather than just writing 3 things we're grateful for at the end of the day, we should probably, before writing the great things we're grateful for, write 3 things we're really fed up about and we want to complain about.
But that's interesting because I've read there's a I can't remember the title of the book now, but there's a book specifically around gratitude journaling where the key was to also be grateful for the negative things that happen in your life and grateful for the anger, grateful for the frustrations. And it's quite interesting looking at it from this perspective because these are all aspects of yourself,
Absolutely.
and it's unavoidable
Yeah.
that these feelings are there. And I find that gratitude journaling can be, like you were saying, a little bit one-sided. I'm grateful for my, I can sit and have my coffee
Yeah.
in the morning in peace. It's like, yeah, that's great, but then also be grateful for the fact that, you're pissed off with your spouse for snoring all night, or, there's
Well,
some.
but you see that, to me, that's just like we've got wedded to the word gratitude because gratitude's a huge thing. I mean, I'm sitting here in Hastings. There's a fisherman's boat out on the beach called Gratitude. You know, it's just getting everywhere. And but you know, so we don't want to stretch credulity too far. So we can look at bad things that happen to us or things that annoy us or irritate us, and say, well, how can I work with this? How can this help me grow? Am I going to move into
Mhm,
another room? Is that going to give me more space? Can I maintain intimacy with my spouse in other ways? And, and so on. But I also think we ought to just allow ourselves sometimes to really be fed up with a situation that we're finding it difficult to change. And just, it's all
yeah,
about truth and authenticity, really, generally. So once you actually see everything through the lens of gratitude, you're already being a bit one-sided.
yeah, mhm. Yeah, and I think, but this is what you were talking about earlier. I think this, in the sense of the city, that there are spaces where we're scared of
Yeah,
going, and I think this is probably one of those spaces where we're being told that we shouldn't be angry, that these things are, non-positive emotions to express, and when we feel them and we feel them deeply, it can be quite, yeah, a dissonant experience, right? And then knowing that it's there is one thing, but then the other thing is then to actually acknowledge it and be willing to say, yes, I am angry, and these are the reasons why I am angry. And I think, for me at least, it seems that the problem with that is because we don't look at it in a perspective of balance. We look at it in very much that this is it.
yeah,
Then it's easier to say, well, I will ignore this and I'll go, I love this person, rather than going, I love this person and I also am furious
yeah,
with them, and being able to contain them both. Like you talked about, that
yeah.
tension, which is reality.
Yeah, and also that the furiousness is part of the energy, uh, sort of climate around that relationship, which sounds like
Yeah.
pretty high energy. You absolutely adore them, but they can drive you nuts. That, and you will miss the irritations as well when you're no longer when that relationship comes to an end. Um,
But I don't think also that that is, eh, the question is it possible to have high in one end without a high in the other end? I remember I always thought that my highs were as high as my valleys were deep.
right,
Basically, mountain as high as the valley is
right,
deep, and that is the balance. And the tension between the
yeah,
two was where life is. And if you have very low high, if your highs don't go up very high, your lows won't go very low either,
Yeah,
and you end up with virtually a flat line of
I
life.
don't think that there's a rule about that, and I think there's kind of going to be less tension around, isn't there? If you are feeling more positive feelings towards somebody than negative one. Yeah. And
Mm.
also sometimes there's a swing, between the two. They're not always there concurrently, are they? So there's
No.
like sometimes things can go very smoothly for a while, and then there can be you can hit a problem. There's something else I just wanted to say about expressing anger, because I think that's really important. There's a bit of a taboo about being outwardly angry with people,
Yeah.
although that's really not in practice very much, because people will express their anger about the world. People often will go around with rather angry faces and voices talking about um, political situations or uh, things they're unhappy about socially. Um, but sometimes sometimes it's not appropriate to express your anger, especially if it's a kind of all-consuming anger. It can be very damaging to a relationship or even to your job situation and so on. So that's where a journaling exercise like the unsent letter can be very helpful, because you can get it all out of you. You're expressing it. You're getting it out of your system onto the page. It's been said, and then you can kind of read it back and make some sort of reflection on it. And so, but what's really important is that you are listening to your anger and acknowledging it and saying it's there. That in
Yeah.
itself is just letting the anger know it's been heard will help it diminish and be less consuming for you.
Yeah, you get a basically a natural delay between the kind of um, non-private expression of the anger. You have an opportunity to express it privately first, and then diffuse the situation naturally before it actually
Yeah,
goes into.
or not express it at all in person. I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes it can be a
Mhm.
precursor to just getting all the frothing rage out of you, and then being able to go and say something that's constructive, or or draw your boundaries in a firm but polite way. But sometimes it can, because sometimes it can be with somebody that you don't actually have a current relationship with. It might be about, the parent who abandoned you when you were very young, or somebody who's
Yeah.
now no longer in your life, possibly because they've died. So, it doesn't have to have a practical application other than just being expressed and heard and acknowledged by the part of you, the sort of the rational part of you, the parental part of you that needs to hear this kind of screaming child sometimes, and calm down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. This is I think the unsent letter is one that I've been avoiding.
Right. Well, um, that's interesting. Because maybe it can be a bit of feel like a bit of a Pandora's box. What are we going to be opening up here? So, but that anything that we are avoiding, including the parts of the city that our internal city we don't want to visit, which is maybe that's one for you, is probably holding
Oh, for
some
sure.
treasure for us. But
I'm just very good at tricking myself.
hmm, well,
So it's
even the dedicated journaler, usually needs someone else to point out to them, and conversations about journaling are just as important as journaling, which is why I think the festival is going to be such a great thing, because we'll go away with insights from each other and also from each other's
yeah,
observations about the insights that we've got, plus the encouragement and support. So journaling can be a lonely business, as well, when you get an insight that's painful or difficult for you, which is why it's great to be part of a circle.
I think absolutely. I think the one of the major kind of drivers for me with arranging this has also been to try to create some level of community around it. Just because my experience of the guys that I've got in the Men Who Write group, that it's it's so obvious and we all know it, but this idea that you're not alone only becomes real when you meet somebody else who is actually in a similar process as
Mm.
yourself. And we can know it intellectually that, oh, yes, I know I'm not alone. But until you actually speak to somebody that you can have that conversation with and go, do you know what? That's really interesting. I can see that you're also in that process.
Yeah,
I think
we sometimes call it writing alone together, uh, journaling
yeah.
process. But it also,
Mhm.
hearing you talk there has reminded me of the mandala, the overlapping circle,
Mhm.
and the brightness, the sacredness really is in that almond shape, that mandala in the center of those circles, and that's when your spotlight overlaps somebody else's spotlight, like follow spots in a theater, and the
Mhm.
brightest light is where you overlap.
Yes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yes, that's what I'm so curious about, just to see how it is when people
Mm.
interact and just are there in a space where there's um, a joint goal of exploration,
Mm.
really. And I think that's kind of the other idea there here that let's use it as a way to explore together.
And experimentation, I
So
think, as well, in a way. I mean, I'm not aware of many journaling festivals. I know that Kay held one a few years ago, maybe 2019 or 18, but in Denver. But and there's a poetry therapy conference every year. But this is going to be interesting to sort of see what happens. And so for everyone attending, everyone's making a contribution to this new kind of culture that's developing. Um, ah,
yeah, and the big focus for me is really on the practical thing. I don't want this to be a conference, because when we started working on it, we're trying to give it a name. One of the ideas, what the hell do we call it? And I think it was Marusha who came up with the idea of calling
it's
it a
great.
festival.
Yeah.
And I think the idea around the festival was more that this is about interaction and it's about coming out of it with workshops and learnings rather than listening to. I mean, I'm sure you could hold an absolutely amazing lecture around Jung and alchemy and tons of journaling stuff, but in the end, having a practical workshop where people come out of it with something real is so much more valuable.
Totally. And I mean, to be fair, some of the organizations that call their meetings conferences do a lot of that as well. But the word
Yes.
conference carries a bit more of a kind of academic sort of weight to it, doesn't it? It sounds like everyone's wearing a suit and a badge, and actually they're not sort of far off that. But I like the idea of festival because it feels like it belongs to the people, doesn't it? And it's a sort of explosion of energy and light and creativity and expression and fun. And I think that's actually the best way to let our inner selves kind of fizz up and think, oh, well, this is great. I want to show myself too. I want to be present here too. Whereas at a conference, it can hide away a little bit, behind the notebook and the lecture lectern.
Yeah, I think you're right with that. This is and the language matters. This is definitely like a big part of
Yeah.
this. So I want to ask you two things to wrap
Hmm.
up. Um, I'm not sure which should make sense to do first. Actually, let's do the not so controversial one, but important one. How are we going to get more men to join the festival?
Um, I think that sort of will take a little bit of thought, but I think going to men's groups that already exist, where men are already kind of exploring themselves. There's one that I know of in London, so it might be good to just let them know about it and offer them sort of group
Mhm.
booking or I'll check out what that is again. But sometimes it's for quite high powered men. I think this particular group I'm thinking is for quite high powered men who've got big careers and who are often sort of suffering from boarding school syndrome.
Right.
So that's sort of one group I'm thinking of. But it's maybe also about letting all the men in the field know that we're doing it. I don't know. Maybe you should let
Yes.
men come free, like they let women come free into nightclubs.
I had an
Yeah,
idea to basically have, like, bring your husband for
yeah.
free, but I was worried that it's gonna end up with a lot of husbands being, dragged
We'll have
into
we'll have to have a
the
crash
journaling
for them.
festival
Watch football.
unwillingly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, we'll see. So anyway, if there are any men listening to this right now, this is an absolutely safe space, so please do join. And
Safe is
then
not the word to
finally,
attract them, but you know what I mean?
yeah, I mean, the ones who understand
Yeah,
it will
yeah, I
join
get
it.
it.
That's fine. It's like and then finally, like what like you were saying about the question to the poet that you were just mentioning, I can't
Oh,
remember
yeah.
her name.
Sharon Old.
The poem, yes. What do you want people to come out of the journaling festival with, especially after seeing and joining your
I
workshop?
think, new friends and contacts, wonderful kind of sunlit, hopefully, memories, um, lots of insights about themselves that they also will have a hunch how to bring forward into reality, and how that can help them, well, move along the Jungian path of individuation, so increase their consciousness. Every tiny sliver of an insight is a way to bring more light into the personality, and also just really put some petrol, rocket fuel in their pen, and make them feel excited about continuing journaling, and continuing, and hopefully becoming part of a community. It occurs to me that maybe it might be good to have a Barcelona Journaling Festival kind of Facebook page or something where people. I did a poetry course in America, and it was called it was the Squaw Valley Community of Writers, which, because of political language issues, is now called the Olympic Valley Festival of Writers. But once you're a member of that community of writers, once you are a member of that community, you're always a member of that community. So you can stay in
Mhm.
touch. So that there may be an opportunity to create a community that grows every year, or however often the festival happens.
Yeah, it's a great
Yeah,
idea, actually. It'd be good for people to have. That's a great idea
yeah,
because it's nice for people to connect before they come as
yeah.
well, and then to continue connections
Yeah,
afterwards. So that's
that's
a nice
a
idea.
closed group. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Brilliant.
Brilliant. It's I always love our
Me
conversations.
too.
They're always fun and always deep, and I always end up writing things down. I can't have a call without having pen and
Yeah,
paper around because there's always something that comes out of it.
yeah.
So
Thank you.
thank you so much, and thank you for coming to the festival to do a workshop. I'm really, really excited about it. I'm hoping I can join it. If
Yeah,
I'm not,
yeah. I think you
I'm
must. You know,
somebody else. But yeah.
you must. I mean, you've worked so hard, and also, you can argue that you actually need to taste it from that side for the future as
Yes,
well. So,
yes,
yeah, um,
I will figure
yeah.
that
I'll
out.
hold you to that. Better come to mine.
Perfect.
Uh, Make sure you do. Great.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you so much. And well, I'll see you in November,
Yeah.
which is
Well, I'm
great.
sure we'll speak before, but yeah, lovely. Look forward.
Thank
Okay.
you.